here with Neal Lester. He's the Associate Vice President for Humanities and Arts at Arizona State University and a professor of English. So Dr. Lester, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
I'm hoping you could give me a little bit of information about your background and your different areas of study.
Absolutely. Well, I'm a professor of English and have been for about 30 years, and my specialty areas are African American literary and cultural studies. And I look at stuff. I look at everyday text, and I analyze, try to make meaning, try to make sense of those things.
So you've done work as diverse as you work on personal ads and children's literature, and just whatever interests you?
Well, I was trained as a literary scholar. So as a literary scholar, I read books, and I analyze books, and I teach books, and I teach about themes and symbols and the ways in which we look at language. But I also look at what I call everyday text, and I think of the world as a textbook, and I try to bring a certain set of skills to sort of understanding better what the world means, but also how we represent the world. And my navigating of the academy has also been an effort to sort of be a public scholar. So what I do in the classroom, I make every effort to translate that so that it's accessible and relevant to everyday people, whoever those everyday people are.
So one of your areas of study is the race and gender politics of hair. And I'm hoping you could talk a little bit about what drew you to that particular field and that particular text.
Well, it's interesting because when I studied other texts that weren't about hair, I'd noticed that hair played some significant role in whatever text I was looking at. So if I were looking at a text by Zora Neale Hurston, for example, I'd notice in Their Eyes Are Watching God that one of the characteristics of Janie, who is the lead character in that novel, is beautiful because she has long hair in part and light skin. And so as I looked at other texts, particularly texts by women, I noticed that hair was more than hair. And there's a play by Adrienne Kennedy from the 1960s called Funny House of a Negro, where a woman loses her hair as she tries to somehow get rid of her roots as an African American, as a black person. So I put all those together and I thought, well, this is sort of interesting. There's more to hair than meets the eye here. And most people would sort of look at that and think, oh, well, it's just hair, it just describes a person. But to have hair and to make hair a point of interest within a text, for me, means that there's some reason for that. And when I started talking about hair, I was initially talking about women and hair, and I learned very early on that women did not want me talking about their hair. So I could understand that because there's a perceived notion of privilege and authority to talk about something that one lives, and I obviously can't live as a black woman. I have hair, but I can't talk about women's realities. So I tried to sort of navigate that in a way that I could still talk about the patterns that I see socially, politically, historically, by talking about hair as it relates to children. And I saw all kinds of ways in which children become the playing ground of adult politics, and hair is just one lens through which we can read those. The other thing that was also interesting to me in studying hair is that everybody has a hair story. Everybody has a hair story. And that hair story connects that person, us, to someone else. And it became this wonderful metaphor for humanities work, the ways in which we do not exist on an island disconnected from other people. Now that connection and the connectivity can be defined differently and to different degrees of effectiveness, but the connections are there. And so hair was just a wonderful way of starting a conversation that on the one hand seemed very specific, and the more specific I talked about hair, the more general I became, because everybody had something to share relative to a hair story that meant something.
So what did you find? What is that relationship between identity and hair?
Well, relative to black women, we can't really talk about aesthetics of beauty and then worth without talking about the way in which hair becomes a construction. One British critic has said that hair growing organically out of one's head or on other parts of the body, and I clarify that my research is on head hair. There are other people who do hair on other parts of the body. But what I noticed is that, and I agree with Kabina Mercer, who says that once the hair grows out of the head in this instance, it really becomes some sort of construction when we do something with it. If we pull it back, if we color it, if we cut it, if we lock it, if we cornrow it, if we braid it, if we straighten it, then it starts to become a social construction, which means that on some level we are creating some message for the world in the same way that we choose our clothes. Now, hair is a little bit more connected to identity than clothes, because there are ways in which we can change clothes and it not have any real bearing on our identity. But when you start talking about people who have different hair textures, and it grows out of one's head and it's perceived as bad versus hair that is straight and perceived as good, then it impacts one's thinking about oneself and one's thinking about oneself in the world.
So could you give me a little bit of context, historical context, in terms of how we feel about hair?
Well, even before slavery, I mean, if you look at what has been recorded in biblical times, there is a sense that women needed to have head covering in order to worship. And so hair became a form of sort of covering the head. And while long hair was not an ideal, it became an ideal in terms of covering the head for those religious purposes. If we fast forward to African American antebellum days, or American antebellum days, what we recognize is there are lots of sources that suggest that black women who were caring for their masters and mistresses' children would often look at their hair and tend to their hair with an almost envious sense that somehow the comb that was being used to comb the straight hair of the little girl for whom they were caring was not the same as their hair. So there was some embarrassment. There was what W.E.B. Du Bois calls double consciousness, where the slave would look at himself or herself negatively as that slave imagined the white master and mistress looking at them in terms of beauty. So the women often, and men, resorted to ways of straightening their naturally curly hair so that it better fit this ideal that they perceived and had been constructed for them. So there were all kinds of creative strategies, from axle grease, from wagon wheels to dirty dishwater, because of the oils, to straighten the hair, and then resorting to using bandanas so that you could cover the hair. So the mammy image sort of comes out of that, or this image of little black children being visually represented as pickaninnies with hair sticking up as though they were rays of sun in very unflattering ways. What was interesting about that sort of attitude and that early representation of hair is that it did not come without these mocking attacks on African Americans and language. So if we find, for example, in those 1800s minstrel songs, references to nappy, kinky hair were there, in the same breath that we had these really, really obscene efforts to mock intelligibility of black people and black slaves in particular. So there are lots of ubs and dubs and ways in which you could convey a kind of buffoonery, a kind of unintelligibility. And so to talk about hair was just to add to that sense of the other, the dark, mysterious, unintelligible, threatening other was somehow also very unattractive. And so these notions of beauty sort of surfaced in ways that led then to these efforts to sort of straighten hair, particularly for women, since men have not characteristically or historically been valued on what they look like. Now, if we talk about men during slavery, certainly the most fit slaves were used to breed, but in terms of aesthetics of beauty, men have not necessarily had to been subjected. Now, men respond to those aesthetics of beauty, and so men are just as much a part of these conversations about women and hair as women are. But I think when we talk about the racial dimension of that, it becomes clear that if we talk about images of beauty in the United States and in the West, those images are typically not people of color or women of color. And in these sort of everyday ways that I look at the world, it's still very difficult to find sort of alternatives that don't exoticize hair that is not long and straight.
So let me zoom out a little bit. As
Okay.
you were talking, I started to think about there's an economic dimension to it too. Because it can be very expensive to, maintain and mess with hair. So can you talk a little bit about that too?
Well, a few years ago, I want to say 2010, Chris Rock did a movie called Good Hair. And in that movie, he talks and shows a lot about the economics of hair. And what was interesting is the sort of backlash that he received from some African American women, because this is primarily an industry that supported, well, black hair care and products is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And what he dared to do was sort of tease out what that means relative to race relations, relative to globalization. And what he found is that between hair weaves and hair products, black women, and by extension, the men in their lives who support either daughters or wives or partners are buying into this. And a lot of it is to move away from the hair that you have to create something else or something that's different. So what I found was that I had no idea how much it costs for a hair weave or an extension, but there are lots of women who do. And it's one of those things where you can get a hair weave or an extension and it somehow feeds into your sense of your place in the world, because those are the images that we see. And it doesn't really matter that celebrities have those extensions because they can afford it. What becomes interesting in this discussion for me is the extent to which there are places where hair weaves and extensions can be put on layaway, and you can pay in installments because this matters. Whether it should or not is not what I try to tease out. What I look at is, what do these patterns mean? What patterns of messaging are being sent to youngsters, both males and females, about what hair should look like?
Yeah, so that was my next question. Do you see these ideas of good hair and bad hair changing? I mean, it's still a multi-billion-dollar industry, so are people aware of what's happening here, and do they want to change it?
Well, there are a couple of things. I think they're aware, yes, and I think Chris Rock helped with that. And we saw that in part through this rash of hair thieving, which happened across the states in the last, well, since that movie came out a couple of years ago. And these were not people snatching wigs off people's heads. These were people who were breaking into beauty supply stores in places with really dense demographics of African Americans and women. And they were selling these hair weaves and extensions on the street. It was actually quite ingenious because it's sustainable. It has no barcode, so it's very hard to track. But more importantly, I think it speaks to this notion of economic crisis, that people were doing something that was entrepreneurial, but it was also related to people's sense of beauty and identity and the aesthetics that we somehow are bombarded with every day. And on some level, each of us is working to fit in, and the extent to which you can create something that enhances, I think, speaks to whether or not we do fit in. So the notion of good and bad has changed a little because I see more people with hair that looks like mine in public spaces. It's still exoticized. I am often reminded that my hair is not just my story, but people respond to me because it's a construction of sorts. And so when I travel internationally, a lot of people want to touch it and they want to see if it's real, because a lot of the stuff is synthetic. And it's still a bit of a novelty. I can't imagine, for example, our President of the United States having dreadlocks in the same way that I can't imagine our First Lady, Michelle Obama, having an Angela Davis afro. And we know the tension that created on one of our mainstream magazines some years ago, with them fist bumping and him, Barack Obama, dressed in an attire that was not Western. So hair matters, and it's bigger than what people perceive as big hair and a bad hair day.
So generationally, do you see, are kids nowadays trying to keep up with this same ideal, or are things starting to change?
I think it's hard to measure progress in these kind of linear ways. What I find, however, is a greater awareness. And here's an example. Our daughter used to straighten her hair. And once she learned in middle school and high school that straightening her hair chemically and then with a flat iron was damaging her hair, she, at about 19, decided that she would stop doing it. And so now she goes naturally, and I use that word in quotes. So I don't know if alternatives to long, straight, and blonde have changed dramatically. I think of that, I just wrote a piece on constructions of blondness as anti-feminism in the movie Tangled, the Disney movie Tangled. Of course, Disney is notorious for representations that people question, and that was one of the things that I wrote about, was this sense that somehow Rapunzel, both in the tale and in their retelling of the tale, was somehow objectified because of her hair. And Hollywood has a long tradition of celebrating blondness and blonde women. And you think of this not only in the movies, but you also think of this in terms of the pop culture. The Farrah Fawcett, for example, or the Jennifer Aniston, or the Dolly Parton, or the Pamela Anderson, or the Britney Spears, or you can go on and on and on and on and on. And it doesn't matter if people were born blonde, they just are blonde. And there's something about blondness, despite the fact that there are myriad, barrels of jokes out there that talk about dumb blondes, there's something about that beauty aesthetic that is somehow almost mesmerizing. And then you switch over to some of the entertainers like Beyonce, for example, who has become more blonde than some of the blondest white women. And there's a sense that the further away she's gotten from Destiny's Child, the more Barbie doll-like she becomes. And we cannot underestimate the value of Barbie and the way in which this doll has created generations of women trying to aspire to an ideal that they will never be able to aspire to. There are others who become closer to that ideal than some, and I think that's where little brown girls get caught into that kind of cycle, because there's a poet, Essex Hemphill, who says, Barbie never told brown girls they were beautiful. And I know there's a writer for Sesame Street who adopted a little brown girl from Ethiopia, and he said that what stunned him was a little girl playing with Barbies and coming to him saying that she wanted hair like Barbies. So he created that little brown puppet called, I don't know her name, but she's a brown puppet who sings this wonderfully charged rendition of "I love my hair!" exclamation point. And she dances around with all of these sort of wonderful ways that she can do her hair without going to a beauty shop and having it straightened. So there are alternatives. And then I started my work as on hair because of my daughter, and the fact that when our daughter was born, her mother is Italian and Argentine, and I'm not. And so there was this curiosity about what kind of hair, from others, about what kind of hair she was going to have. So in many ways, I've chronicled my work on hair by looking at the ways in which both sides of the family and communities have responded to her hair. So it's been an evolution for me as a parent, it's been as a brown parent, and as the parent of a brown child, to sort of look at these race and gender dynamics of things that to other people seem so insignificant, when in our world, it's actually not, and in most people's worlds, it's not. I'm co-editing, or not co-editing, I'm special editing a issue for the journal The Lion and the Unicorn on children/childhood and hair. And one of the essays that has really hit me is an essay about children with cancer and the ways in which hair becomes extremely important in terms of constructing gender when hair loss is there. And then from there, I'm reminded of women in my own family whose hair is thinning and the extent to which that really impacts their identities as women if their hair is thinning. And that's aside from ways in which the body can respond to cancer and take away body parts that somehow define identity. But in all of this, once I've pointed out how important it is, I have to be reminded of an India Ari song that says quite specifically, I am not my hair. That sometimes my hair is just creativity or expressing myself. But for other people, that hair always means something, it always signifies something. And part of what my research tries to do is to tease that out and get people to look at what seems everyday and the mundane, and sort of raising that to a level of more thoughtful conversation and more critical thinking.
Good, do you have any final thoughts,
Well, everybody has a hair story, and either people have had hair, they want hair, they can buy hair, they don't like their hair, they color their hair, they straighten their hair, they curl their hair. I've challenged my students when I teach classes on this or when I write on this to find a hair story that does not connect them to someone else. And it's every day. You don't have to look for hair stories. There are hair stories in the news. I mean, I'm looking at children, for example, who were denied access to a school in Louisiana because they had locks associated with their religion. Or I'm looking at another case where a little boy didn't cut his hair, but it violates the dress codes that specifically say that little boys or boys cannot have hair below the shoulders. Well, girls obviously can. So there's something inherently gendered about hair. And I haven't done as much with boys and hair, although I do have a son and he has fluffy curly hair and he doesn't like his hair. And that may have something to do with people said when he was young that, oh, curly fluffy hair is such a waste on a boy. So there are all these ways in which hair feeds into these gender constructions and racialized constructions. And I think, if we could look at sort of everyday text, it helps us understand so much about ourselves and the world.